This is the second of our series of webinars on WTO agriculture negotiations and sustainable development. As you can see in the program, we have included links to the reports and articles the speakers will be presenting today, all of which we thought could help inform the conversation on PSH at MC13. We have listed in the program an excellent article on revising the WTO measurement of agricultural price support to resolve the impasse on PSH, an article written by Professor David Orden, one of the speakers today, and Lars Brink. We also have a landmark report by FAO that was co-authored by Cosimo Avesani, also on the panel today. And we have an IISD report on 5 possible options to find a permanent solution on PSH. This report was co-authored by IFPRI, Joe Glauber, and Tanvi Sinha from the Commonwealth, also on the panel today. So I am thrilled to have the authors of all these fantastic reports and articles on PSH in a single panel today. So let me introduce our first speaker today, Cosimo Avesani, an agriculture trade policy analyst with FAO. Cosimo delivered an excellent presentation on PSH at the COA, the Committee on Agriculture, in March this year. So I guess that many of you have already had the privilege of listening to him. The idea of his presentation today is to have a sense of the balance that exists between the objectives of users of PSH programs to achieve food security goals, for example, and the possible trade implications of these programs, of the use of these programs, especially when it comes to international agri-food markets. Cosimo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Facundo. I think the presentation will be shared shortly. Yes, here it is. So next slide, please. So basically with this presentation, my objective is to present you what public stockholding programs are, let's say in practical terms. I would like to show you the basic objectives of the programs, what their key functions, let's say, are, the related policies that are needed, let's say, to make them run, and of course, what possible impacts PSH programs can have on the domestic and on the international markets. Next slide, please. So public food stockholding refers basically to the procurement, storage, and release of food stocks by governments through state-owned enterprises or other public agencies. Public stock basically comprise of both domestically procured and imported food. And let's say that even though there is, let's say, considerable diversity in the way in which such programs are implemented in each country, the programs generally imply stockholding of cereals that are prevalent in national diets. They are less perishable and normally very important for food security. One of the reasons behind the choice of establishing a PSH program is that in the event of production shortfalls or market disruptions, a large number of people can fall in distress. And in fact, in this report, we observed that countries that have, let's say, a history of famines or that are frequently exposed to shocks, droughts, floods, conflicts, are generally, say, more inclined to maintain stocks, and in particular of grain. Now, we can generally say that countries tend to maintain one or two generic types of food stocks, emergency stocks, buffer stocks, and stocks for domestic food distribution, which basically differ in their objectives. So the emergency stocks are mainly used for cases of acute food insecurity, to reduce the vulnerability of consumers to supply or food price shocks caused by emergencies. The buffer stocks, they're used to stabilize the prices over the regular agricultural production cycle. And of course, stocks for domestic food distribution that aim to promote, say, the physical economic access to the adequate quantities of food. And they are very common when we're facing chronic food insecurity. However, let's say that in practice, the distinction with these different types of stocks can be unclear, since countries often attempt to achieve several objectives at the same time. Next slide, please. And now let's see what are the three basic elements of public stockholding programs. Next slide, please. Which are, of course, procurement, storage, and the release of stocks. Now, depending on the program's objective, these functions are carried out or reinforced through a combination of policy measures, each of which, of course, can have implications for the consumers, for the producers, both within and outside the country that is implementing the measure. For instance, on the procurement side, countries have, let's say, historically implemented measures such as market price support to farmers. And on the stock release side, countries have often implemented a number of consumer support measures to support, for instance, vulnerable populations, for instance, during emergencies. And in the past, they also made extensive use of export subsidies, let's say, to empty the stocks. Now, all these actions have the objective to accompany, let's say, the programs, but as every single policy measures, they might also lead to unwanted, let's say, consequences that can be both domestically and internationally. But let's have a closer look to them. Next slide, please. So let us look at the price support measures linked to the procurement of public stocks. Now, it is clear that when a country procures at admin price, they can try to achieve the policy objective to, let's say, support the farmers. And this has obviously some positive effects, because by providing guaranteed market outlets and predictable prices, public procurement can definitely support farmers' incomes, and this is particularly true for smallholder farmers. On the other side, by providing a price floor, you may also provide incentives to farmers to basically overproduce. And if we assume price transmission, procurement at admin price, particularly when they are, let's say, above world market price, is usually considered a form of trade distorting subsidy. And at the same type of concept can be applied on the release side. Now, we know that public stockholding programs are often directly linked to social safety measures. So countries often implement measures to ensure that certain quantities of food can reach the vulnerable population at a subsidized price. And this is positive, basically lowers the price of food for layers of the population that are in need. However, when the measure is not properly designed, let's say the overall benefit received by the consumers can be downside, can be compromised. So what is the point of this slide? Very simple, that when we are looking at the measures that accompany, that reinforce public stockholding, depending on their implementation, the implications for the producers, the consumers, and the markets may change. Next slide, please. And of course, now let's see how diverse, let's say, these problems can be. Next. So these examples come from a study that we prepared in FAO a couple of years ago. The study basically provides a survey of public stockholding programs in 19 countries plus the European Union, and covering all regions. The slides present 5 country examples showing the diversity in the objectives, the type of stocks, the procurement-related policy measures. In a nutshell, what we can observe very quickly is that, like, there are some countries that tend to prioritize procurement from domestic production. Some use domestic production and imports to replace their stocks. Some others mostly basically rely on imports. Then we have countries that use the food reserves with the main objective to stabilize the prices for staple crops. Others use procurement to support family farmers. Others have a focus on both food emergencies and price stabilization. And while this seems kind of a very simple point, it is important to recognize that there is a huge diversity in the way in which these programs are implemented, and that they are not directly comparable to each other. And the same is happening when we look at the release side. Next slide, please. So, like in some countries, like the EU in the past, a key outlet, let's say, for stocks were the exports, no? For which export subsidies were used. In other countries today, the main outlet for stocks are domestic, and stocks can be released through free food distribution during emergencies, food distribution programs, like I'm thinking about school feeding, with direct subsidies, with the use of food vouchers. So overall, I'd say that these very few cases demonstrated that with public stockholding programs, first, that countries very often aim to fulfill both producers and consumer-oriented objectives. That their implementation involves a number of policy measures, like we've seen before, procurement at admin price or consumer support measures. And that third, both the objective and the policy measures that are used to implement the programs have changed over time and continue to evolve. Next slide, please. And now let's see, of course, the market impacts of these programs. Next. So public stockholding programs, of course, can have impacts for both domestic and international markets. And this slide focuses on the domestic considerations. So for producers, public procurement at guaranteed price, even if it is at below market international price, can provide a stable market and, let's say, less variable income. And this is particularly important in difficult settings and in underdeveloped markets. However, procurement can also create, let's say, an over-reliance on the institutional markets, limiting as well, in many cases, market development. For consumers, we have seen that the distribution of food stocks during the emergencies, but as well as a part of regular food distribution programs, can be an important form of social protection for the vulnerable populations. But in the longer run, production may also be skewed, let's say, toward commodities that are procured by the government that typically are, let's say, serious because they are, let's say, non-perishable products or less perishable products. And this may go at expenses of products with higher nutritional values. And if you look at government, of course, stock procurement and release, let's say, a rather practical way to support the domestic consumers and the producers. But operating public stockholding schemes comes with a very, very, very high fiscal costs. And as well, there might be some implementation challenges that can compound this cost. And when I say about very high fiscal costs, in our report, we see that some countries in the past have been spending up to points of GDP, okay? 1.5 points of GDP percentage. So that's a lot. And therefore, let's say, to achieve the intended benefits of public stockholding programs, it is important to ensure that the target of the beneficiaries is well done. And this is true both for stock procurement and the release. And next slide, please. Beyond, let's say, the domestic considerations, public stockholding programs can also, of course, affect traded volumes and prices, depending on the scale and operation and the size and status of the market of the country that implements these programs. And this ultimately, of course, has impact on producers and consumers in other countries. Like for producers, the effects are mainly negative. For instance, import demand is usually reduced in countries holding large stocks, and thereby, let's say, reducing market opportunity for producers in other countries. And if stock release decisions are unpredictable, this can, of course, influence as well the price levels. For consumers, of course, ample stocks can provide confidence in the availability of supplies to deal, let's say, with exogenous shocks. But the concentration of supply in few countries can imply as well uncertainty about the availability of those stocks on the world markets, always in the event of, let's say, global shocks that can affect other countries. So considering of the potential impact of public stockholding programs on global markets, the matter, I don't need to tell it to you, but has been subject to a significant debate over the years. Next slide, please. And now some final remarks before concluding. Next again. So, as I was saying, public stockholding programs can aim to achieve different objectives. In practice, however, the line between these different types of objectives can be quite thin, with countries implementing programs that aim to simultaneously fulfill several objectives. And precisely for this reason, public food stockholding programs worldwide are hard to compare across countries. Differences apply to the way countries procure, manage, release their stocks. And of course, public stockholding programs can play an important role, both domestically and internationally. And for instance, as mentioned, ample supplies of food reserves can have a stabilizing effect on commodity markets. And public procurement, when is properly targeted, let's say, can provide as well smallholder farmers with predictable prices and higher incomes. And subsidized food transport linked to the public stocks can ensure the physical and economic access to food for the poorest and most vulnerable consumers, despite any volatility in food prices. However, we also discussed several, let's say, negative implications and trade-offs. And let's say, in addition to their very high fiscal costs. And for this reason, public stockholding programs should be always carefully evaluated against other policy alternatives in each individual context. This is probably the most important message they wanted to deliver with this presentation. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion and to receiving your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Cosimo. This was a nice overview of PSH programs, including the trade policy tools that are normally used to put them in practice. Now we will turn to our second speaker today, Joe Glauber. Everyone knows Joe quite well, either from his time in USDA, including his stint as the chief economist and the US chief agricultural negotiator during Doha, or maybe through the excellent analysis he produces for IFPRI. Joe, you have a lot of experience both as an analyst of agricultural markets and also in the negotiation arena, including here in Geneva and at the WTO. And I was wondering if you could walk us through the negotiating history of PSH, including the proposed changes to the green box that we find in the Rep 4, the famous Rep 4 from 2008, setting out modalities for WTO agricultural negotiations. Joe, you have the floor.
Sure. No, thanks, Facundo. And first, let me just say how happy IFPRI is to co-sponsor this event. It's such a timely topic. It's a topic that we've struggled with, I think, as members of the WTO over the last several years. Hopefully, we'll get some resolution to this. And I'm also personally very thankful for the opportunity to be on this panel. These are great panelists. I've worked with David, I've worked with Tanvi, and Cosimo. Just you're a hard act to follow. It's a very good overview. So I think one of the major accomplishments of the Uruguay round, I think most people would agree with this, was the fact that it brought discipline to agricultural domestic support. And if you remember back in the 1980s, when the Uruguay round was being negotiated, we had the EU, the US, many other developed countries were supporting producers through a broad array of distorting subsidies. Particularly egregious, I think, were price support programs that supported producer prices far higher than market prices. That resulted, as Cosimo pointed out, that encouraged overproduction, much of which ended up in government stockpiles, much of which ended up having to be ended up in government stockpiles, which were then dumped onto world markets, further depressing prices. And I think it's in that context, that the domestics disciplines that we now know as the Agreement on Agriculture, and in particular Annex 2, that those were being negotiated. Yet the other thing is that early on in the negotiations, members saw the need to distinguish between measures that were production and trade distorting, which would be subject to discipline, which ends up what we now call the amber box, and those minimally distorting policies, which would be exempt from the green box. Public stockholding programs established for food security purposes were recognized as potential green box policies really by the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I think the issue was how to construct criteria to ensure that programs were not backdoor ways to support producer prices. Here's just one example. In terms of the negotiating history of paragraph 1, I believe this is essentially what ends up as the Dunkel text, that yes, public stockholding programs were identified as potentially exempt from domestic support, but there was concern that these green box programs not have the effect of providing price support to producers. And so early versions of the language tied eligibility to purchase at current market prices. Next slide. So here's what ends up in Annex 2. I think everyone knows this language pretty well, but you can see again that essentially that it says it allows for public stockholding programs that where purchases are being made at administrative policies, but it says, hey, if you're doing that, then that has to be taken into account in your AMS. Next slide. And there again in footnote 5, that if it says that programs under which stocks of foodstuffs are acquired and released at administrative prices, provided that the difference between the acquisition price and the external reference price is accounted for in the AMS. Next slide. So there were just a lot of discussions leading up to the so-called Rev 4 text. But I have to say, of the many issues that were swirling around in the DOA negotiations, this was probably far less prominent than it became, after 2008. But nonetheless, there was we see that Rev 4 at least contained potential changes that would exempt this reporting of the support in the AMS of if it were supporting low income or resource poor producers. This was at the time hotly debated, but again, because of the Rev 4 text, essentially been very little discussion on this particular language afterwards. Next slide. What happened, of course, is after even starting in the mid-2000s, we started to see price rises. If you look at prices over the period 1995 to 2005, prices were relatively flat. And remember that we're looking at an administered price relative to a fixed external price. For most countries, that fixed external price was the 1986-1988 base period. So if you look at prices over the period 1995 to 2005, they are relatively in line with the historical base period, maybe a little bit higher, but relatively in line. But following 2005, we saw this big boom in biofuel production, big boom in energy costs, which drove prices up, large export demands coming from emerging markets, other countries, and we saw price levels generally rise. The big spikes, of course, in 2007-8, but even then, we saw prices still continue and level off at levels far higher than the earlier period, the 1995 to 2005 period. And again, more recently, of course, we saw price spikes again with the war in Ukraine and more recently with what's going on in the rice market right now. Next slide. So if we look at current prices, you see that they're quite high relative to the 1986 base period. Here I've just looked at this chart just shows current prices as a percent of the 1986-88 base period. And again, just to make the point that over the period 1995 through about 2005, those prices were, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but pretty much in line with the 86-88 base period. That changed a lot. And if we move looking at just prices in January 2023, you see that corn prices, maize prices were 336% of the 86-88 average. Wheat prices, again, 3 times that, and rice prices over 228% that of the 86-88 base period. Next slide. So the implications of that for market price support, that is what countries, if they're using administrative prices under current rules, have to then report to the WTO as part of AMS reporting, is again this thing. And David's going to go into this in much more detail. The administrative price minus the fixed external reference price times eligible production. Again, as price levels rose post 2005, some countries raised administrative prices. They were below they may have been below current market prices at that time, but they were getting increasingly larger than the fixed external reference price. And that means that market price support for many countries started to look very, very close to de minimis levels. And by 2012, where, as I say, this was less of an issue in 2008 or on fewer people's radar screen in 2008, by 2012, it was a very big issue. And again, this led to the negotiations in the ministerial in Bali, et cetera. Next slide. So there have been a number of proposals to fix the external reference price. Facundo mentioned this excellent paper by David and Lars Brink. And then Tanvi and I also had a paper on this a while ago. But again, here, I'll reference here at least the G33 proposal back in 2013, which would have tied the fixed external reference price to a 5-year Olympic average. Now, Olympic average is take the last 5 years, throw out the highest price, throw out the lowest price to give you a smooth rolling average here. And you can see the dotted line there is the Olympic average, and you can see that trends and follows the wheat price pretty closely. However, the criticism is that, yes, that's true, but at times, for example, when prices started falling for wheat post 2013, that Olympic average still would have been far, far higher than the potential market price. And there, I think the issue would be, does that provide significant price support? Next slide. And here I'm just going to wrap up, and I'm not even going to spend much time and give back some time for the other speakers. But I think that this concern about these programs having potential price enhancing aspects has always been a concern. David's going to go into the calculation of this support and the flawed nature of the measure. But I think that, again, it's hard when you have prices moving up and down that any sort of measure at times, in a static market, certainly, you'll have sometimes measures that are going to be, anytime you deal with administered prices, you can have administered prices all of a sudden providing significant price support, and other times less so. And with that, I'm going to stop, Facundo, and give the floor back to everyone else. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. It's always great to go back to the negotiating history to understand the rationale of many of the current issues and discussions at the WTO, and also to look at the market conditions, how these market conditions, in particular here, food prices, for example, have revived many of the debates at the WTO. I think it's not big news to say that, well, one of the most contentious issues of the PSH negotiations at the WTO is the way market price support, MPS, is calculated at the WTO. In fact, in June this year, we had a very interesting session organized by Indonesia on behalf of the co-sponsors of the JOB AG 229 document on the external reference price, the ERP, used in the current aggregate measurement of support, the AMS, under the WTO Agricultural Agreement. And while I think that everyone here in this room is aware and well informed about these discussions, I thought there would be some value in bringing fresh ideas to the WTO agricultural negotiations on PSH. One of these fresh ideas comes from one of the brightest minds, I would say, in the field of agricultural trade. And I am speaking about Professor David Orden from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute in the US. David suggests bringing the concept of market price support closer to what it would be an economic measurement of support. And he argues that this could even help resolve the current impasse on PSH. So I very much look forward to hearing David's ideas on this. David, you have the floor.
Okay, well, if I could have the first slide. Thanks, Facundo, for organizing these 3 days of webinar and for the opportunity to participate. Like Joe, I'm very pleased to join the other excellent panelists that you have over these 3 days. I'm going to look at the issues of addressing the public stockholding issues in a particular way, which is through the recalculation of market price support. If I could have the next slide. This is joint work with my colleague Lars Brink, and there are two resources for this presentation. One is the overall book that we published earlier this year with Cambridge University Press, which is available in the WTO bookstore, which covers the broad experience over the past 30 years and prospects for the future of agricultural domestic support measures and disciplines. And then Facundo already mentioned a related journal article in Trade Law and Development. The nice thing there is that that's available open access. So if you're interested in seeing a text and digging more into these issues we're discussing today, you can just Google that and download it, and so can anyone else. If I can have the next slide. Well, the measurement of market price support, as Joe has already illustrated, it's nice for Joe and I to have this sort of 1-2 back-to-back presentations. I guess we've been working together 1-2 back-to-back for 30 years, Joe. The measured market price support is an issue in the public stockholding negotiations and in recent disputes. So in terms of the negotiations, the issue of assessing the reference price was included in the MC12 draft ministerial decision on agriculture, and members continued with discussions and proposals. As Facundo mentioned, there was the information session on the external reference price in public stockholding programs in July of this year, which I expect many of you may have attended. In terms of the disputes, as China and India have become large providers of support, their market price support programs have each been challenged. For China, it was market price support for wheat, rice, and corn, challenged by the United States with a panel report adopted in 2019. That is, neither party appealed the decisions of the panel, and that panel report went into effect. And China has somewhat modified its programs accordingly. For India, the dispute was brought by Brazil, Australia, and Guatemala about price support for sugarcane. These are all sugar exporters. And the panel report was released in December of last year, but has been appealed, so that case remains unresolved. Now, at issue in the disputes is the measurement of the level of market price support under the agreement on agriculture, as it's measured in this agreement. Joe's already put this formula up, and I've repeated it here. You have an applied administered price that's announced by the government. Otherwise, you don't measure market price support as part of domestic support. You subtract from that the fixed external reference price for original members 1986, 1988 is the basis for that fixed external reference price. For newer members like China, that base period can be more recent. And then you multiply that by what's called eligible production. Okay, if I have the next slide. Now, in the disputes, what's at issue is how to apply the agreement formula, which is repeated on this slide, how to measure each one of these elements of it, and therefore what kind of measure of market price support you get and how that compares to the country's limit. Now, it's also important that the economic measurement of market price support and the agreement measures can differ. And this is really important, and it's problematic if the measure under the agreement deviates widely from the economic measure, because in terms of achieving the objective of the agreement, you would want the measure that's being evaluated to have a close correspondence with economic support, which is the support that actually affects markets. So let's look at the economic market price support just very briefly. Some of you may not have had economics since maybe you were undergraduate students. So remember, in the economic market price support, as say measured by OECD, you take in a particular year the domestic price, you subtract from it the border price, which is really the opportunity the country has as an importer or exporter in the world markets. And if there's a difference there, let's say it's a positive difference so that farmers are getting some support compared to what they would get at the international prices, you multiply that by total production. Now, that's also an important piece of the economic measurement, because even if a government is only procuring a certain part of the production, or if it has some other protection measure like a tariff, in either case, that higher price in part of the market is going to arbitrage up and pull up the price in the rest of the market. So in the economic measure, this gap in prices is applied to the total production as the market equalizes with the price that's established, at least for some part of it. Now, if I could go back to the previous slide for a minute. Okay, so let's look at these in a particular context, which is the sugarcane support of India in the dispute that was recently adjudicated, but still remains unresolved. So if we look at this little table, as you can see, OECD estimates that the market price support, which is measured here as a percent of value of production. So you divide the measures that are on the top part of the slide by the value of production at domestic prices. OECD estimates that support has been positive for India in the years of the dispute and increased in the last couple of years before the dispute was launched. So that increase in economic support may have been what stimulated the competing exporters to bring a case against sugarcane support in India, but that economic support was not an issue in the dispute. In the dispute, what the panel looked at is how to measure the price support under the agreement formula. And you can see that the panel's decisions were that price support under the agreement's formula was, much higher than the economic support estimated by OECD, as many as 4 or 5 times higher. So how does that occur? Well, in the case of sugarcane, India has a legally mandated price that cane processors have to pay to sugarcane producers. And the panel determined that that was an applied administered price and basically set the domestic price. So the domestic price and the AAP were similar. It also determined that price was available to all farmers, so eligible production was equal to total production. So that piece of the two formulas was similar. So the difference comes from subtracting from the AAP this fixed external reference price measured in Indian rupees, nominal Indian rupees, subtracting from a nominal AAP in the current years, 2014 through 2018, subtracting from that a nominal rupee price from 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, creating a large gap that has very little economic meaning and leads to these large numbers that under the agreement, India will be required to come into compliance to bring those numbers down below its 10% de minimis limit. Okay, let me have the next slide. Well, what about arguments in the public stockholding negotiations? Many developing countries, as everyone knows, argue for a permanently exempting from limit market price support for public stockholding programs. Joe mentioned briefly, but maybe we should reiterate that under the Bali 2013 agreement, public stockholding market price support is sheltered from challenge, but on a temporary basis until a permanent solution is achieved. So again, the proposal 229 from the African group, the ACP and the G33 calls for a permanent exemption. Other members consider this support should remain subject to limits under the agreements on agriculture. And again, an example would be Brazil's submission 230. Now, we take some issue with both of these arguments. Permanently exempting 116 developing country members for market price support for major commodities could prove inconsistent with the long-run objectives of the agreement on agriculture. So that has to be a concern. Countries tend to increase support as they become wealthier. If market support is unbound, we could see distorting market price support emerge, as we have in China, for example. Now, at the same time, in terms of retaining the limits, one has to ask whether it is appropriate to base compliance with those limits on measurement of market price support along the lines of the sugarcane panel, which is the type of measure that some opponents of a permanent exemption put forward. If I could have the next slide. Well, let's look for India at rice and wheat, which are public stockholding commodities. And you can see in this graph that OECD, with careful analysis, has concluded that overall, during the last 20 years, 12 years here, farmers in India have received lower prices than the equivalent world prices evaluated down to the farm gate level. In other words, they've been disprotected rather than protected. Nevertheless, if you apply the approach of the sugarcane panel, that is measuring AAPs and fixed external reference prices in nominal Indian rupees, and applying this to total production as eligible production, then you get these very high levels of agreement market price support in the range, again, of the 60 to 80%. Now, India doesn't agree with this particular way of measuring market price support under the agreement formula, and it notifies lower levels. All right, if I can have the next slide. We're getting towards the end here. Sorry if I'm going a bit too long. Can these differences be narrow? Well, having found fault with both sides, we explore a lagged reference price market price support resolution. So this is the lag reference price that Joe is also referring to. We retain in this formula the applied administered price, so there's only market price support if there is a program that announces a price that farmers are guaranteed, but subtract from that not the fixed external reference price, but a lag reference price, which is a moving average of recent border prices. And as in the economic formula, we multiply this by total production. Now, 2 points about the lag reference price. First of all, when governments set the applied administered price, they would know at that time what was going to be the reference price that would enter into the calculation of market price support. So very similar to the fixed external reference price. But unlike the fixed external reference price, this lag reference price would move with market developments. It wouldn't match the market price in any particular year exactly, but it would follow the trend of those prices. Now, Joe pointed out that in some, you might get a few years where prices suddenly drop, where this lag reference price gives you a higher price and more room for higher prices in the individual country, still consistent with this limit on domestic support. But the larger point is that a country would likely only be challenged of providing excess market price support if consistently over time this formula led to a measure of market price support that exceeded its limit relative to a trend in border prices. All right, if we have the next slide, we're almost done here. But you can see very quickly the main point here, which is that the lag reference price measurement of market price support closes the gap between the economic support and the measure that will be applied and disciplines applied. So if we had had this measure, India would not year after year be confronted with being challenged that its market price support might be in the 60 to 80% range. It would be recognized that its market price support was down, in fact, in the negative range most years, similar to OECD's estimate of economic support. But notice that there are a few years towards the end, 2017, 18, 19, 18 in particular, 17, where Indian prices do push up high enough that under this measure, they reach up towards this 10% de minimis limit. So there is a limit here. It has eased the difference. It has eliminated this arbitrary high level of market price support being measured under the current agreement formula, at least as specified or as applied by the panel and by some other countries to rice and wheat. But it does still maintain a limit. So if I can have the next slide. In conclusion, we conclude that revising the measurement to bring the agreement market price support closer to its economic value would improve the rules for domestic support. And we argue that this on its own, and this is a critical point, that on its own, not just as a supplement to extending the exemption or leaving support unlimited on a permanent basis, but on its own, revising the market price support measurement could in fact resolve the public stockholding impasse. For the developing countries, as I pointed out, they wouldn't have to comply, or they wouldn't be forced to comply with AMS limits, wouldn't require reducing artificially high measurements. But for proponents of limits, they would be assured that there were such limits and that those disciplines had a sound economic basis. Who can object to that? Well, let me stop there. Sorry again if I've gone on just a little bit too long.
Thanks, David. This was very interesting. And before moving to our last speaker today, I want to encourage everyone to type any questions you might have in the Q&A box. I see one interesting question on the negotiating history of the FERP in the Q&A. So I encourage everyone to type all your questions, or immediately after the presentation that we will hear now, we will open the floor to the moderated Q&A. You can also raise your hands and we will give you the floor. So now we turn to our last speaker today, Tanvi Sinha from the Commonwealth. Tanvi advises small states of the Commonwealth on agricultural issues here in Geneva, and she was previously with the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division. She is the co-author, as I said, of an IISD report discussing possible pathways to unlock the current impasse in the WTO agriculture negotiations. The other co-author of that IISD report, of course, is Joe, who has just spoken. Tanvi, could you please walk us through the main ideas of that IISD report and the 5 policy options that you and Joe proposed in relation to WTO agriculture negotiations on PSH? Thanks.
Thank you, Facundo, and good afternoon, everyone. And just wait for the presentation to be uploaded. So firstly, I would like to thank IISD and IFPRI for giving me the opportunity to present at this webinar. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about various options that members could consider for potential permanent solution on public stockholding purposes for food security. Next slide, please. So my presentation is, as Facundo mentioned, it's based on the paper that Joe Glauber and I co-authored, and the link is highlighted on the slide. So in his presentation, Joe provided a bit of negotiating history and also David of PSH negotiations, and highlighted the evolving market and policy context in which these programs operate. So as part of my presentation, I will shed some light on various options for a permanent solution on PSH that we have laid out in this paper, which draws from the debates, research, and members' proposals that have been tabled mostly in this context until August 2021, when this paper was published. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights the broad options that we have laid down for members to consider. And I would like to highlight that these options are not exhaustive. And in this paper, we have highlighted that the members could consider these options on their own or as a combination of different options. So broadly, these include updating the base periods, which are used to calculate the AMS, revising the definition of eligible production, exempting support when administered prices are set below the international prices, exempting LDCs and other small economies, and lastly, establishing a permanent solution based to some degree on the Bali decision. Next slide, please. So in the first options, members could consider updating base periods that are used to calculate the AMS. And this option would have the advantage of better capturing the degree of distortion arising from minimum support price policies by effectively taking into consideration the extent to which price inflation since the late 1980s have affected the gap between the administered prices and the external reference price. So this could be, on one hand, favorable for developing countries who have these PSH programs in place, but also for exporting countries who are concerned about distortion effects of these programs. And they might consider that this option has the advantage of better capturing the degree related to actual distortions on the market. Another potential advantage is that this option could be a good basis for updating rules and the agriculture domestic support that most members have held as a priority in the negotiations. So while considering these options, members could then have to address whether the question that members would have to address is whether the updated base period should be fixed or floating, which is to say that whether the base period should be tied to a fixed date, which remains unchanged, or should they change it over time, for example, by taking the form of average prices in a recent period. So while a fixed base period offers, when we look at these two options, while a fixed base period offers greater predictability from a legal standpoint, it doesn't capture market distortions over time, meaning that members would probably end up in a similar situation again in a few years' time. And in this case, if they choose a fixed base period, they would also have to agree on which period would constitute an acceptable basis for measuring the support as those making the use of the minimum support prices. So in the case of the country members who are making the use of minimum support prices, they might go for a period of exceptionally high prices, while other members might choose a period of exceptionally low prices. On the other hand, if a floating period were chosen, members would also have to agree on the duration. And here, past research has examined a 3-year price average and a 5-year Olympic average that Joe also referenced in his presentation. So here, in which the highest and the lowest values are excluded from the calculation. And in the case, in the latter approach, has the advantage of excluding years in which prices may have been abnormally high or low. Next slide, please. So another key component of the calculation of domestic agriculture support is the question of how to define the quantity of production eligible to receive the applied administered price. So one way is pre-announcing the maximum volume of food that the government intends to procure that could help resolve any issues that countries might face in complying with the WTO domestic support commitments. Members could also consider exempting procurement that represent less than an agreed threshold of percentage of the volume of production. However, it is also likely that countries procuring a large share of their domestic farm output would be unwilling to consider this option on its own unless it's combined with other options, such as updating base periods. Another option is exemption of self-consumed output from the calculation of eligible production, particularly for the smaller economies in which subsistence producers constitute a large share of farming population. Further, there are 2 case references where jurisprudence from one of the cases, which is the South Korea beef case, suggests that the volume of production should normally be considered to be the totality of production in the country, which is fit or entitled to be purchased, unless there are reasons to consider that production eligible to receive administered price is a lesser volume. And similarly, in the China domestic subsidies case, the WTO panel established that the quantity of eligible production would be the entire volume of production, leaving out any out of grade grain. But it also left the option that the government announces a maximum quantity to be purchased. However, it has been argued that in the cases above, the panel left open the avenue that the government can pre-announce a maximum quantity it will procure, and that defines the QEP instead of the total production, and that it has been stressed that setting a cap which is less than the total production moves the minimal support price measurement away from the economic measurement that David mentioned. Next slide, please. So numerous analysts have suggested exempting support under public stockholding programs from counting towards AMS or de minimis limits when pre-announced administered prices are set below the level of international prices. Moreover, administered prices may provide an effective floor to market prices and thus provide some implicit level of price support, even when administered prices are below market prices at the time of the announcement. So exporting countries in particular might perceive this as an advantageous option. However, countries using these programs might fear that this approach would not provide with an adequate legal certainty, particularly in the event when the international market prices fell suddenly. Next slide, please. So in the fourth option, we outlined that members could consider exempting LDCs and smaller economies. So as we know that these programs are very expensive and most LDCs and other smaller economies lack the financial capacity to carry them out. And so far, they have not appeared to be at the risk of breaching any existing WTO commitment levels. Moreover, production linked support provided by LDCs would likely to only have minimal implications for global prices, production, and trade. However, it is observed that developing countries who are procuring food at administered prices under these large-scale programs may not consider this option on its own. Therefore, an exemption for LDCs and other small vulnerable economies might need to be combined with other options. So in going further, going a bit deeper into the exemption criteria, we highlight the three main criteria, which is based on the 1999 to 2004 base period, which includes that their average share of world merchandise trade represented 0.16% or less. The average share of world trade in non-agricultural products represented 0.1% or less, and that their share of world trade in agriculture products amounted to be no more than 0.4%. And lastly, member could also adopt a situational approach that exempts programs that conform to certain characteristics. For example, it could be size of the program, percentage of affected total world population, or percentage of total world trade in a particular commodity. So instead of seeking to exempt certain categories of countries. Next slide, please. So in the fifth option, we argue that a permanent solution could be established to some degree on the Bali decision. So this approach has been driven mainly by an options paper from Ambassador Ford, who was then the chair of the WTO Agriculture Negotiating Committee, and where this paper suggested that the potential outcome could most likely be based on some form of Bali decision. So the idea is that members could increase flexibilities in specific areas, such as product coverage, which could be compensated with more rigorous requirements in other areas, such as safeguards to prevent circumvention of the agreement, or transparency requirements. So here, three main areas were identified where members could trade off between greater flexibilities in exchange for more stringent requirements. And these three areas include a potential cap on support, inclusion of new programs, and product coverage. For example, members could consider less stringent requirements if the programs are capped, and it could be vice versa. Similarly, in terms of new programs, there could be more flexible requirements if the safeguards are made stronger, and vice versa. Here, a number of low-income countries have indicated that they do not currently operate these programs, but they may wish to have the policy space in order to do so in future. Members seeking greater flexibility in this area would need to balance the offensive objective of ensuring the policy space with the defensive objective of ensuring that this policy space provided to other members do not undermine their own food security and rural livelihood goals. Similarly, in the case of product coverage, the broader the program's coverage, the stronger the safeguards could be, and vice versa. So if the members decide to pursue a permanent solution based on the Bali decision, they might want to also demonstrate that none of the food procured none of the food which is procured at administered prices has subsequently been exported to international market. And with all this aligned, there is a broad agreement on the need to enhance transparency, where some members have suggested that countries with large public stockholding programs or those that are large exporter of certain products could be subject to more stringent transparency provisions compared to countries with smaller programs. So here we adopt a differentiated approach where we are also sensitive to stringent transparency programs, which could be onerous for the smaller economies in particular. So with this brief explanation of the different options we have laid out, I would like to end my presentation and looking forward to the discussion later. Thanks so much.